Hopefully you can all hear me okay. If not, do shout up, but don't shout at me because I've got issues. You can hear me. All right, thank you. My name is Person Irresponsible. The Americans always hear it as Personally Responsible, so if you're looking for the person to blame for the last week, hello. I was first contacted by Paul back in on the 23rd of April 2024 with the immortal line, "It struck me that you would give a super talk." At this point, all Paul knew was my name was Person Irresponsible. Moreover, and probably quite importantly, he wouldn't be able to pick me out of a police line-out. He, of all people, must surely have known that the godfather of boarding school survivors literature or psychology is, of course, Dr. Nick Duffel. He segments us into the three archetypes: complier, crushed, and rebel. It is not for me, a completely untrained psychotherapist, to be so sufficiently arrogant to argue with Dr. Nick, although I'll give it a seriously good attempt by suggesting he missed the archetype class clown. I am not a suitable person to take to a funeral. I laugh at all the wrong things. I am incredibly cynical, I have a terribly quick wit, and I have a tendency to play the fool. It probably surprises absolutely no one. I was asked to leave both my boarding schools. So they say that the difference between stupidity and bravery is measured by success and survival. If Paul is still the chief speech finder next year, you can determine what the committee thinks about his choice for this year. But talking of the committee, I think it's appropriate for me to thank them from the bottom of my heart for their tireless work in putting together this event, as well as giving us all a space to find each other across the world. Especially as for so many years, I'm sure like many of you, I had tried my hardest to forget where I had been. I first attended the convention last November, and I was just 6 months since I dropped out of the delusion. I sobbed mercilessly all day. So whilst I may joke throughout, please accept that beneath this very cool, calm delivery is a middle-aged woman with a very middle-aged bladder. My journey began in mid-2022 when I set off to explore the mother country in a van with my South Korean imported cat. I wanted to learn something about this place that I am from and that I currently live in, but feel a tremendous apathy towards. I am, as they say, a TCK, a third country kid. I do not feel that I am from here, nor am I from there. I am from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I have always felt apart from, detached, a bystander. I'm a look at me but don't you dare notice me kind of person. And I knew I'd be writing my second book, and I quickly realised that almost all of English history boils down to man fighting man in a boggy field. More importantly, I discovered that not only is parking in England tremendously expensive, it is also very difficult for me to navigate a long wheel-based vehicle into a diddy little car parking space. So instead I decided I would visit every single county in England and explore the rude and funny sounding place names. In other words, I started at Shitterton. I finished at Weedon. And if it has a cock in it, I probably met him. Underneath all of this, one of my personal goals as I journeyed round was to explore why I had ended up so driving phobic that I refused to get behind the wheel of a car for over a decade. What was more baffling about this particular fear, which I now know is a neurosis, is that the fact that I stopped driving the day I had parked my Lada Niva, sample here, Russian shit heap, that I'd just finished driving from central Siberia to central England in 2003. I didn't start driving again until 2014 when my marriage collapsed. In those intervening years, this is what makes it particularly baffling. I became the first woman to jet ski around Scotland. I became the first woman to fail to jet ski around the UK, making just 75% of the journey. I was the first person, man or woman, to quad bike around the UK. I learnt to drive a digger, a tractor, and a dumper quite competently. And across my life, I've now lived in 16 different countries, many of them quite dangerous and quite tough. I am the kind of woman that other women describe as really brave, and yet I was terrified of driving a car. And in 2020, as is already said, I had a lot of time, I think a lot of us had a lot of time to think in 2020, but I had a lot of time to think in 2020 because I walked from Mexico to Canada, and there's not much else to do than walk and think and walk, and that's pretty much the whole journey done. And still, despite that, I did not recognise the significant impact the boarding school had had on my life. And then I arrived in February 2023. I am not here. I walked into a room I had never been to previously. I was there to reminisce with strangers about familiar times. There were just 6 of us present that night. We talked about matters of the day as much as what we'd been like, what had happened, and what we are like now. Unlike many meetings, this one continued for the full hour and a half, giving us an opportunity to speak for a second rotation, one at a time, never interrupting each other, never giving advice, just listening and perhaps nodding in identification. It came back to the man who had spoken first. I cannot repeat what he said, but he said something to the effect of, I went to boarding school, and what happened to me there was criminal. I was never sexually abused, but it was criminal. Once he had finished, the second speaker said, I went to boarding school, and in very, very general terms, he related his hatred of the place. The third speaker, whose turn it now was, said, I went to boarding school. He talked for some time. The fourth speaker, yet another man, said, I too went to boarding school. Then it was my turn. I was the only woman present, and I reintroduced myself in the customary fashion by stating, my name is Penny, and I am an alcoholic. That string of words that typically I am so careful only to say in those rooms. Outside of them, I always say, I'm Penny, just in case the other part tumbles out and I startle my listener. I protect my anonymity for the most part, but I have been increasingly open about my drinking career, which ceased nearly a decade ago. I wasn't an epic drunk. I didn't go to prison. I was never caught drink driving. I didn't even put cornflakes in my vodka in the mornings. In fact, I never drank or barely ever drank before 6 p.m, but when I drank, I couldn't stop, even if I wanted to. I was your archetypal binge drinker, and the gaps between binges got shorter and shorter. I didn't want to quit drinking, but I desperately needed a break from the booze. Alcoholics Anonymous appealed simply because the woman on the phone promised me I could call myself Mickey Mouse for all anyone cared, and no one would give me a form to fill in. Moreover, I would never need to tell a soul, and I did ask, but what happens if someone recognises me? And she said, well, are you famous? I said, no. She said, I don't see the problem. And she said, most importantly, I never need darken their doors again unless I chose to. I have been back hammering ever since. I was, like so many of us, consumed by shame and humiliation. I was overwhelmed by a problem bigger than I could fix, and rare is the occasion that I asked for help. But back at this particular meeting, in February 2023, my shame and my humiliation is long gone. I am comfortable about being a recovering alcoholic, and I continue to attend AA. The room's a great place to get water for one's van. In other words, they keep me wet as well as dry. And because I'm one of those people that if you say your cat is black, I will say my cat is blacker, even though he's grey. So I said, I went to 2 boarding schools, I told the group. The first was a prissy all-girls affair. I think I was 9. I now know if you have a birthday in the term time, dates are a bit hazy. I had flown in from Papua New Guinea, just around the corner, probably accompanied by my elder brother, who had been sent away 1 or 2 terms before. He resided at an all-boys facility on the other side of the country. They didn't even keep us together. I have no memories of getting to the school, the flights, who picked me up at the airport and who took me to the stately home. I don't remember seeing the endless green fields for the second time. I can't tell you what the weather was like. I can only tell you I was drowning in the stupidly old-fashioned school uniform. I can also tell you what the doors sound like when they banged closed for that first time, leaving just me and another little girl who also started out of sync with the academic year. As is typical, I have since learnt the adults in the room leave to go and say goodbye properly to one another. We stood there staring at each other, and after some time we decided to go up to the rooms, picking up our tuck boxes and charging up the nearest staircase, the one I'd used when I'd been shown around the school many moons prior. Get down from there right now, screamed a voice from stage right, amplified by the long Elizabethan hallway. It was the first inkling of what boarding school was like. I don't need to tell you, you know. You know the bells, the barracking, the bollockings, and the bullshit of it all. I felt screamed at for years because I was screamed at for years. I hated every damn second of it, and at some point I stopped being compliant and I began to rebel. My mother lamented, "You were destined to be head girl," at my 13-year-old self, and she said, "And now they don't want you at all." So I was moved to a former all-boys school. Going to a local school was never considered, even though A, we have no family boarding school backgrounds, and B, both Papua New Guinea, where I lived, and now Africa, where my parents were now living, had schools. They had a British school there. So it wasn't necessary, as I had thought. My brother and I were the first and hopefully the last to be sent away. I can tell you 3 things about the second boarding school. The food was a lot better, it was a lot busier, and we were shouted at a lot less. That said, it had quite a few more paedophiles. So I told the men the first one was horrific and the second one was okay. I was and have always been a believer that boarding schools were ostensibly a good thing. I encouraged my now ex-husband to consider it for his only son. His mother was aghast at the idea. Thank God. Moreover, I didn't really have much in the way of memories. In fact, I'd never talked about it, not even my 4th step, and for anyone that's familiar with the 12-step program, the 4th one is that says, we made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves, which is a very grandiose way of saying we wrote down all our shit. I'd always believed I was the problem. The system was not in question. I just accepted I was a wrong 'un, a problem child, awkward, difficult, and irrepressible. So that's what I told the men gathered there at the meeting of February 2023. And just to close the meeting of February 2023, the 6th man now had his time to speak. And he said, "I went to a fucking comp, but I'm still a fucking drunk." The next day I woke up with just one burning question. What are the odds of walking into a room full of non-drinking drunks and 5 of the 6 of them being ex-boarders? What are the odds? I was perplexed by the probability of this, but thankfully I had been educated far beyond my natural capabilities, so I could turn to the God of all my understanding, Dr. Google. Dr. Google says boarding schools are bad for children, but it also says 0.5% of British boarding schools are packed off to boarding school. I worked out then that I should have been walking into a room of 400 recovering alcoholics, or thereabouts, in order to meet a fellow ex-boarder. And I quickly realised I didn't have enough hands to count all the ex-boarders I knew that I had met via a cup of tea and a shitty biscuit. I'd always assumed that I knew so many teetotaling ex-boarders was because I ordinarily live in the la-di-da Cotswolds. But I currently was nowhere near there. I was in a place that would not invoke snobbery nor inverse snobbery. And that was the moment my delusion was shattered. Not cracked, but utterly shattered. I have long since accepted that my alcoholism was most likely a result of a flawed gene, some genetic disposition, and it was just bad luck. A lot of recovery literature takes this approach. It's a family disease, yada, yada, yada. That my body metabolizes alcohol in a different way from normal people's. Like I have a form of ethanol diabetes. Now I had to ask the question, was I born alcoholic or was I made? I continued to travel around England, going to 2 or 3 meetings a week. Whenever I could, I mentioned I had been to boarding school, irrespective of whether the meeting took place in the salubrious side of town or otherwise. And at each meeting, I'd watch to see who else twitched. There were always twitchers. Typically, after each meeting, someone would come up and say, "I went to boarding school too." Often there was a queue. I've noticed we're very good at queuing. So it turns out, as adults, we are disproportionately represented in Alcoholics Anonymous. How proud we must make our parents. I started to realise that there was a lot more to this boarding school thing than I had previously understood. And of course I began, like so many of us, with Nick Duffell's book, The Making of Them. And I started to realise there were perhaps commonalities. I started to question my premise that I'm not okay, but everyone else is fine. I started to look at my knowledge of the world. I have a master's in adult education, and yet I couldn't recall a single piece of research regarding boarding school's superior educational claims. Nor could I think of any supporting developmental psychology, and whilst my expertise was in adult learning, to understand how adults tick, you've got to understand children. I'd also trained as a family mediator, and yet knew the family court system heavily stresses a relationship with both parents as being imperative for the child's best interests and welfare. But we didn't even have phones at my first boarding school, and being a third country kid, that meant 12 to 15 weeks of no contact whatsoever with my parents. In my second boarding school, we did have access to a phone, but it was placed at the bottom of the entrance to the boys' dormitories. There was no privacy and no peace. And of course, being in AA means I know women who have had their children removed from their care. Almost always, those children are placed with other members of the family. If that's not possible, then they go to foster homes. And if that's not possible, and in very rare occasions, are children put in children's homes. How is it we live in a society that is the exact opposite of how I grew up? And I also started to realise a few things about myself and other ex-boarders, and I hope to God now that I'm not the only one who does these things. I gobble down food. I don't eat. I inhale the damn stuff. And I was at a birthday party not long after, and 10 of us were there, 5 ex-boarders and 5 not, and we just happened to have a sort of apartheid system around the table. We were split in two, head down, shoveled it all in, looked up, carried on the conversation, look across, they're pushing it around the plate, they're picking at it, they're making conversation, they're laughing, they're joking, and I'm sat there thinking, hurry up, we have dessert to inhale. I struggled to sleep alone at university. Everybody else would go for half-terms, weekends apparently. They're not called exeats in the real world, are they? And they'd bugger off and I'd be left in the shared house, and I could never sleep till dawn. I had chronic insomnia. I was terrified of sleeping alone. My first job overseas, I was given an apartment, and I met my now ex-husband there. And my number one reason for letting him move in so fast was because I needed a bloody good night's sleep. It turns out, not a good reason to marry somebody. I have an inability to relax, you might notice now. Okay. Observation and criticism, my brain computes in exactly the same way. I'm a psychedelic wallflower. I don't want to be noticed, but I want you to see me, or vice versa. I'm a task-focused, overachieving certificate collector who can't hold down a bloody job. I also held this belief that feelings were for weak people. Not very nice, is it? I had an inability to ask for or accept help. An abject fear of making mistakes, and this probably has been the biggest impediment to my life, is I won't try things in case I'm not very good at them. And yet, of course, to get good at something, you've got to try things. Commitment, I'm not just a commitment phobia, I'm terrified of commitment. I was once offered a 2-year job and I would negotiate it down to 18 months because 2 years is a bit much. Normal people are looking for a job for life. And this is probably the saddest, is never expecting to be believed. In my early 30s, I had to have an ovary removed because apparently they explode. I did not know this. And after I'd had the operation, I was with the gynecological surgeon, and he said, oh, whilst we were in there, we noticed that you're absolutely torn up inside. You're just a mess of scar tissues. And he said, you must have the most horrifically painful periods. And I burst into tears, and he thinks I'm crying because he's effectively told me I might not be able to have children. I'm crying because for the first time in my life, a man has told me my periods might hurt. And all my life I'd been told, well, you're just like all the other girls, stop moaning. Yeah. You're trying to skive, get off games. And I've carried that with me my whole life, and I still struggle with it today. And then again, I carried on with the, being undeserved of a normal life. I always feel that somehow I'm just not going to get that for myself. I had no idea that, of course, I'm creating my own reality. I also came across this particular book. I think most people are familiar with it, and everything started to make sense. I thought initially when I heard Joy speak, and she talked of the soul murder, I thought, well, it's a bit dramatic, Joy. But she really, truly, by reading this book, it gave me the language to articulate how I felt, how I saw the world. And that is the thing that I think it robbed me of. It's because I was so young, and children are all about feelings, and we had to then mask or hide or deny or suppress our feelings. I didn't have the language. And so everything then, with the ABCs, everything went into perspective. My peripatetic life, staying in a marriage even when it was toxic, was my fear of abandonment, why I drank, all my problems with male bosses, a general discomfort with being female, and yet a dislike and distrust of groups and women and girls. A complete inability to have fun. An ex-boarding friend of mine said, when we try to suppress the bad feelings, we're also suppressing the good feelings. And that denies us of everything. And I just never felt like I belonged to anyone or anything. And around this same time, through sheer coincidence, I had gone for a coffee with a friend. It was a swanky sort of place with bookshelves, and I picked up this book completely by randomly. And if you're not familiar with it, and most people won't, Margaret Humphreys was a British social worker, and she happened upon discovering that from 1950s to the 1980s, the British government sent children in children's homes overseas to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Rhodesia. And all throughout the book, the author and her many subjects asked, how could they? How could they send us away? And what needs to be bear in mind, these children were not orphans, they had living parents. They'd been put in temporary care, obviously for financial reasons, because the parent was sick, and the parents fully intended to recover their children when things got better. And the parents were told these children had been adopted into loving homes. And with the exception of Rhodesia, they were not. They were put into children's institutions, many of which extolled Christian values, and many of which are still household names today. And they asked over and over, how could they? And of course, like many of us, some of them went on to be incredibly high achieving, incredibly wealthy. Quite a lot became drunk. A lot of them had difficulty in relationships. Would we seriously tell them it was the making of them? How could they? They asked over and over and over again. And we know how. We know because it had happened to our leaders, our decision makers, and they were sent away themselves. I have had lifelong struggles with depression, and I've never understood why every single spring I get so low when everyone else is starting to admire the daffodils and getting excited about the warmer weather. I now know the body keeps the score. Yet, I also know that every time I wanted to talk about it, I felt dismissed, minimised, and over-talked. If I ever said to somebody, oh, I wish I'd gone to boarding school, what would happen is they'd say, oh, I wish I'd gone to boarding school, and then they start to talk about their childhood trauma, and it silenced me from talking about mine. I also knew that everything was going back into 3D. Pandora's box was open, all of those memories went into Technicolor. And I also knew that if I didn't get help fast, and good help really fast, things weren't going to get better. In 2018, I was already diagnosed with CPTSD, and I didn't feel that the help that I got then really got to the root of my problems, because I didn't know then what the root of my problems was. I'd watch other people get into recovery, and I still felt on some days I was drowning. And I wished just somebody would tell me what to bloody do, whilst knowing that if anyone tells me what to do, I'll do the bang bloody opposite. So the light started by getting some specialist help. If only the therapist could see me now, she'd probably be thinking, oh, that's what you look like when you're not crying. And every week she was asking me, how are you feeling? And each week I had a one-word answer, gaslit. Like alcohol, boarding school had lied to me. I saw my lack of cultural identity and my perennial search for one. I don't fit. And because my experience of the world is unusual, I don't have the same cultural reference points, either family or nation. And I realised my need for adventure is a response to boarding school. I only feel authentic as a human being when I'm scared shitless, when my insides and my outsides are in balance. There's a bear, I'm scared, that's normal. Because, my anxiety feels acceptable when I'm doing something stupid. But most importantly, I learnt I'm really not unique, special, or different. And despite seeing many, many therapists over the years and being in a 12-step recovery program, no one had ever asked me, how was boarding school for you? It turns out boarding school is not okay. Around this time, I came to the Boarding School Survivors Conference and felt the rage. And yet, overwhelmingly, I felt a part of something. And I felt, for the first time, my true survivorship. My feedback was, why are these things always in London? Wouldn't it be better if there was something going around the country? It could reach more people. So I set something up. And I wondered what would happen if I brought together a load of ex-boarders and therapists who hadn't been to boarding school, and we talked about what happens when one does go to boarding school through a series of structured discussions. I thought it would be a one-off project, a way of exploring my own experiences and hearing others. 5 events later, I was bloody knackered. So I'm very grateful to the committee for their hard work. But I did get a lot of feedback. Some of the feedback was, I can't come, it's just too painful to contemplate. That was the most commonly thing that I got. I used to get lots and lots of emails from people talking about their experience, but they couldn't come and talk. I love boarding school. These things only focus on the negative. Boarding school literature is like an overboard patriarchal stew on steroids. Can't argue with it. It is quite male-centric. And it's too expensive. And one of the beautiful things is we've got Chris Roach here today and his new initiative, which is going to hopefully tackle many of these issues, but particularly the 4th point, and I'll leave him to talk about that. So that's why I did that. And then also I was invited onto this particular documentary that's coming out soon. It looks like a rogues gallery, and what I'm particularly curious about is the organiser, Piers Cross, is the only one that's given himself anonymity. If he does find himself in a police line-out, it's the beard that gives him away. It involves spending 4 days on a retreat, which sounds lovely and fluffy. But there I learnt to engage with my inner child. I let the class clown play properly and responsibly. I let myself dance really badly. I let myself draw out my heartaches. I cried, I laughed, I bonded. Most importantly, for the first time in my life, I did a role play. You know those toe-curling cringe things we've all had to do at work? I sabotaged them. I didn't. And this time Piers was my dad and Zoe was my mum, and I got to say to them what boarding school had done to them, but more importantly I got to look at what boarding school had done to them and for them as well, and what they had lost by sending me away. And that really helped me shift, because I moved from the how could they into, gosh, we all grieve, don't we? Because we never got our bonds back. My mother is dead, but I didn't speak to her for 5 years prior to her death, and I haven't seen my father since I was in my 20s. I don't have a relationship with my brother. For months afterwards, I learned many things I previously didn't realise, but it really accelerated my healing journey. But by God, it was painful. For many months afterwards, I felt terribly homesick, a revisiting of that perennial feeling of my childhood, though now, thanks to Joy, I can call it a bereavement. Grief cannot be escaped from. It has to be walked through. It can't be drunk away either. And that's why, like the best adventure, healing truly hurts. But I can also now see the gap between what I was taught and what I needed as a child. Oh, I like this. It's gone a bit wonky. I like how competitiveness is leading the race out there. No, I didn't do that at all. What have you done to my slides? The 4 C's of the 21st century are, of course, critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, and communication, but the values instilled in me were conformity, compliance, competitiveness, and containment. Little wonder my 20s were so damn hard. I think, as Tim also said, I just didn't know how to fit in the world at all. And me, the personal true costs of boarding school were what it took away from me. My community. I lived in the expat community, but I also lived in a local community too. And that was a very, they say it takes a village to raise a child. My village was very colourful. It had lots of different people, lots of different cultures and knowledges of the world. And I got put into a mono system, a monolingual system, a monocultural system, and it was baffling. It also took away all my comforts. I had cats, dogs, horses. I lost all of those things. I had choices. I could eat what I liked. I had lovely fruit available to me in Papua New Guinea. And of course, once I got to boarding school, we were allowed 1 apple and 1 orange a week. And it took away my ability to care. In my first boarding school, we weren't even allowed to wash our own hair, let alone do sort of normal self-care things. And that, particularly in the last 10 years, I've had to learn how to look after myself a lot better. I do have a long way to go, though. But other things, as I've learned, and I'm sure people have ever noticed this, there are seemingly higher rates of ex-boarders who are child-free or less. You can choose your own suffix. One of the things I came across a lot was parents of children, that when their children become the age that they were sent away, they suddenly lose that imprinting and that knowledge of how to actually be a parent, and that can be quite a crisis of confidence. But there seems to me, and there's no research yet, but if anyone wants to do any, that there seems to be extraordinary levels of us who do not have children at all, and I wonder whether that is because the crisis of confidence kicks in a lot sooner. The relevance of boarding school values and how incompatible they are to the modern world. I can't imagine just because you put central heating in carpets and curtains, the values have changed significantly. And finally, sorry, I'm going to catch up with myself. How are the expat ex-boarders doing? This really touches my heart. When I was at the first and second boarding school, they started bringing in cohorts of Chinese students. They couldn't speak a word of English. They were probably around 12 or 13 years of age. I was prepared for boarding school because my mother's cooking was that atrocious that at least when they gave me the food, I learnt how to eat it. But how would it have been for a Chinese student coming here to English food, not speaking the language, not recognising the clothing, and the weather just being so markedly different, the buildings, every single thing, all of their schematic knowledge of the world being so alien for them? How could that have been, and yet they wouldn't have had the words either to talk about themselves? I wonder how they're doing today. They don't have a boarding school survivors convention. And they're particularly worried because currently 1/3 of the UK's boarding school cohort have been pulled in from overseas. I have noticed if I suggest to parents what you should do for your child's aspirational future is send them to China, aged 8. It doesn't go down well. So as you know, I set off on a journey to reacquaint myself with my home country, with the submission of trying to understand how and why I had ended up so driving phobic. Only I could have discovered about a year later that had I read Nick Duffell's book through to the final chapters, in the last chapter he talks about a woman who came for treatment for her driving phobia. Needless to say, she was an ex-boarder. I could have saved myself a lot of fuel and just read his bloody book. My name is Penny, and I am an ex-boarder, and I believe that the boarding school system is stupid on almost every level. I just want to say again, the difference between bravery and stupidity is survival. We survived, and I thank you for your bravery in coming here today.